Inserted in your bulletin or handed out with the bulletins this morning was an orange sheet that describes and gives you a rare thing, a full outline of the sermon. So those of you who are really interested in knowing exactly where this is going and about how long you have left to listen to this, there it is. But the reason for this is that this is the beginning of a sermon series that is focusing on the work that I've been doing over the summer to prepare for a Doctor of Ministry degree. And the reason why this is essential isn't because I'm interested in degrees or titles or any of that other stuff. But one of the things that I'm most passionate about is leading extraordinarily well for the future of the church. Having been in pastoral ministry for about 18 years, one of the things that I can say is that the church has shifted just a little bit in 18 years. And to be fully transparent and honest, the goal of leading well into the future means that I'm attempting to subject myself again to the rigors of academia so that I can lead you as faithfully and effectively as possible for at least the next 18 years. Make sense? So the purpose of this series is to wrap up the first year of the Doctor of Ministry degree, which has everything to do with the ability to rethink and redo and reorient life toward faithful service in the local church. And so the emphasis of this whole degree is the revitalization of the church and its mission. And the first year has been focused specifically on the revitalization of the pastor as leader. And so there have been some substantive changes that I've been attempting to make throughout the course of the year, and some of you have noticed them. But the course of this summer is an attempt to go deeper into what it means to live fully into the life that God truly has for us. And so over this week and the next couple of weeks is an opportunity for us to delve deeper into what it means to redeem the way that we view our work, our leisure, and our time. That's the entire series. To redeem the way we view our work, our leisure, and our time. So, to define work, so that you don't think I'm retired and I can just check out of the entire sermon, work is basically anything that's not defined as leisure. It's any activity that you do that provides value, either to yourself, to your home, to your society, and especially to your God. It's anything that's an adding value, which means you don't necessarily have to have a job in order to do work. Some of you who don't necessarily quote-unquote work outside the home, you know that you have work to do, yes? And sometimes the work that we do is not necessarily paid or compensated, but it is definitely not exactly leisure, but does indeed fall into the category of work, right? So work is anything that's not leisure, and next week we'll talk about how there is some crossover, but we're specifically focusing on the side that is work today. And that's all that it is. So the way that we view work through a few different lenses. One is through the ability to acquire those things that we need or want. So the way that we acquire needs or wants, basically, if there's something that we need, we go to work so that we can acquire what we need. So if we need food, some of the ways that we might work would be to gain money so that we can buy food. If we don't have a job, you could actually plant. We do this thing around here called planting a garden. You could work and till that garden, and then you could produce food, which back in my grandparents' era, they'd produce enough food that they would can that and then store it all through the winter, right? In other words, there is work that can be done to fulfill our needs and wants. But the wants part is where it leads into a little bit of another issue, because it can cause us to begin to see work as something by which we begin to acquire as much as humanly possible. And the more that we begin to fall into a period of acquisition, the more we can fall into some overworking or workaholism, and it can lead us to yearn for stuff that we don't necessarily need. It can distract us from life that is truly called to be life. Make sense? Some of us, not me, just saying, some of us might view work as a curse. If you've ever felt like work is a curse, then you understand what it's like for work to feel like drudgery. It's some obligation, something you have to endure, something you have to go through, something that's absolutely required as part of the necessities of life. Some of you may have even been singing the song, I owe, so off to work I go. And so you understand what it's like to see work as an obligation or as a curse. That work then is not something that fills us with any sense of life or satisfaction, but it's something we do because it's necessary in order to make the ends meet, in order to subsidize our existence, in order to do the things that we've already been doing in our lives. Make sense so far? Work as a means of production. So some of us view work as a means of production. It's what you produce. In other words, eventually that deteriorates into your value. That what you do as a result of your work is what places value on your life. What have you produced or what have you done? Now this is where it's interesting to be in pastoral ministry, because value doesn't necessarily mean that I can show you exactly what I've done to produce something, right? That there's not necessarily a production value. Now, there is a sermon at the end of the week, but that's a small part of what it means to be in ministry. Right? But this is the most public aspect of what you see. In other words, the value of pastoral ministry isn't seen in what you produce. It's seen through relationships. So the more that we put an emphasis on work as a means of production, the less it values us as humans and more it values us as what we produce or what value we add to our work. Another view of work is as a means of human achievement. In other words, some of us view it as something to conquer, a problem to solve, that we go to work because we're gonna get something out of it, a reward or a bonus, or we're gonna get an attaboy or an attagirl, or we're gonna get some promotion. And we can achieve successes or climb corporate ladders or arrive at some goal that always seems elusive. And so sometimes we view work as some sort of a human achievement. We can also see it as a means of psychological satisfaction, that it's something that gives us meaning to our life. And in fact, it gives many of us a sense of personal identity. In other words, when we're in social settings, what is one of the questions that you might ask people? What do you do? And our response isn't who we are or what lights our fire. It goes immediately to the position that we hold. So in other words, I am Wesley. You knew that, right? I'm Wesley. You know what I do for a living is I'm a pastor. And that identity becomes something that surrounds everything I do. Because believe it or not, when I'm eating out at a restaurant, you know what I still am? Right. So there's a sense of psychological satisfaction that occurs, but what happens for many of us is that the thing we do becomes our identity, and sometimes those are not necessarily one and the same. Make sense? But for psychological satisfaction, what it can do is it can give us a social element, it can provide structure to our day, that it can provide some sense of stability, that it equips us to have some sense of purpose or life. That's what it means to have psychological satisfaction. It can also be viewed as a means of service. So if you're retired, you retirees, your work isn't done. It's kind of like a truck. If the outer edge of the treads come off, you put on treads, right? So you may be tired, but you can be tired, right? You can. See, but I know I'm here all morning. And afternoon, we have confirmation. But the idea of retirement isn't just for the goal of idleness. The idea is that we employ ourselves for service, so that we put ourselves at work to serve others. That ultimately becomes about altruism, to serve one another, to actually benefit those who are not ourselves. Make sense so far? Those are at least 6 different ways that we could view work, and chances are pretty good all of you fall into one of those categories at some point, right? If not, that's where you make a note and you fill out the eval on the back and send it to me later, right? But if we're going to develop a theology of work, if we're going to think about the ways in which God might work through or create a theology of work, which is something that I've never heard a sermon about in any church where I've grown up, if we ever think about the theology of work, then how is it that God would equip us or God would call us to experience or to engage in meaningful work? And so, what we see is there is work in creation. When God opens the book of Genesis, when the book of Genesis opens, and if you have ever tried to read that behemoth of a book called the Bible, you've probably engaged the first chapter, haven't you? What does God do through the first chapter? God creates, right? Is that a method of God working? Yes. But for God, it's not toil, it's not drudgery, it's not a means of psychological satisfaction. What it is it's more like an artist at play, creating and calling forth things. In the very beginning, when God creates a garden, and this is the text that was read for you a moment ago, God breathes breath into the life of a human. It's not just man, it's Adam. It's a human, it's a person, it's somebody who's breathed into existence. And God then gives that human something to do. Now, most of us miss this, and quite frankly, I did too, that the first person living in the Garden of Eden actually does have a job. To work and to till the land. And then, towards the end of that chapter, God creates Eve. Not just a helper, but a partner. Listen, if anybody tells you that there's a disparity between men and women, or that one is better than the other, let me tell you, from the beginning, it was not so. That the two humans were created as equals. They were partners in the work together. Now, we'll talk about the fall sometime later. I'll do a creation series, and we'll have a little bit of fun really dissecting the book of Genesis. But for now, let it suffice to say that the first bit of opportunity in the garden was that they were employed. They were set to work. Work is a matter of creation. And if you look in the New Testament too, what you see Jesus doing is Jesus also had a job, didn't he? Anybody know what he was? He grew up as an apprenticed carpenter. And then he became somebody dedicated to the work of God. He was God from the very beginning. That's what we'll talk about at Christmas, so strap in your seatbelt. But he is God from the very beginning, but he's apprenticed as a carpenter before he begins his public ministry at the age of 30. In other words, from the very beginning, God works, God creates. Does God also experience leisure? Yes, but that's next Sunday, so I'm not going to continue there. In the beginning, God works. There is work from the beginning of creation. Secondly, there's also the necessity to understand work as a curse. I've already said some of us view work as a curse, right? Let me share with you a couple of great examples of things that I think is work as a curse. Every Friday, there's a couple of trucks that drive down our road. And before those trucks drive down our road, my wife says, "Take out the garbage." Now, I do not wake up on a Friday and go, "You know what I get to do today? Woo-hoo-hoo! Garbage!" You know, I also hate emptying the dishwasher. Not a fan of vacuuming the rugs. Karen won't let me touch the laundry. But those of you who've been around a while, you know that these are not necessarily tasks that all of us are gung-ho about, are they? But are they work? Do they add value to a household? Of course they do. See, after creation, there's the story of the fall. Adam and Eve take from the fruit that they're not supposed to eat, and I promise you that's a series for another day. But after the fall, work then is seen as a curse. From the 3rd chapter of Genesis, this is what God says after the curses are set. "Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you will eat from it every day. Weeds and thistles will grow from it, and even as you eat the field's plants. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return." In other words, work is a curse. The fall is not what introduced work into creation. Work existed before the fall. Did you guess? But work changed as a result of the curse, in that our efforts sometimes push back on us, and even our best intentions are sometimes met with resistance. So work becomes a curse. Make sense so far? Are you with me? Is this totally boring you, putting you to sleep, or is this just I'm trying to do a check. Is this okay? You happy so far? Want me to okay. The last thing that I would say is this. Developing a theology of work always necessitates that work is eventually seen as some form of a calling. What do I mean by that? It's some form where our faith is interjected into our work. That we begin to see it as a way in which God can use us in the midst of our work. And so as a calling, what we realize is that the entire earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Psalm 24, verse 1. That everything that is created is God's. And so anything that we do, any essence, any effort that we put forth is actually a method of participating in and working as part of the calling of God. Now the truth is, if you look through the Bible, there is no such thing as a sacred and secular job. Every job throughout the scope and tenor of Scripture, if used well, is used as in employment and in service to God. So, I made a quick list of things that I could think of as professions in the Bible. What do you think? What professions do you find in the Bible? Shepherd. Yep. Fisherman. What? Carpenter. Yeah, I gave that one to you earlier. Good job. Tax collector's in there. Yep. Farmer. What's that? Masons. That's right. Stone cutters and masons definitely are in there. What's that? Priests. Soldiers. Fishermen. Teachers. Kings. Prophets. Potters. Musicians. Singers. Loggers. Yes, because he had to cut the wood for the temple. Thank you. There were weavers. There were tent makers. There are scribes. There are judges, artisans, metal workers. There are, fishermen, tax collectors, teachers. In other words, all the professions throughout the Scripture are noted because of the way in which they serve God. Now, it's true there are some professions in the Scripture that are not utilized to serve God, but every time that we see the professions offered, they are offered in service to God. Make sense? In other words, every profession, if utilized well, is offered as a calling. Now, if we apply this to our life, because obviously a sermon should have some sort of application, right? We should be able to apply it to ourselves, our work to ourselves, our work to society, and our work to God. So we apply it to ourselves. And what I mean by application to self is that if we do our work well, we should be able to find some sort of pleasure or fulfillment in our work. And the way to do that isn't necessarily to escape from the work that we currently do, but to have the opportunity to change the way that we view our work. So for instance, we can do this a couple of different ways. One of the major ways to do this is by thinking about the way that we view or how we see or how we understand our work. We do this by changing our mindset about our tasks, about the relationships that we engage in, and about the cognitive method, or about the way that we think about our job. Let me give you an example. My first job was at Hardee's. I got $4.25 an hour to work at Hardee's. I know. I was living the dream. My first paycheck at $212 was awesome. Now, for $4.25, I was invited to come to work every morning at 5 a.m. all summer long. And I got to make biscuits. Now, when I made biscuits, I could make those things, yes, they were made from scratch. You make those things from scratch, you roll out the dough, you use all kinds of flour, you create the biscuits, put the trays in the ovens, and you start making sure that every 4 to 8 minutes there was a new tray of biscuits coming out of the line. With me? In other words, the breakfast at that restaurant would shut down if it wasn't for the biscuit maker. So I could take a look at the task, and I would say, this restaurant is mine. And so I started showing up at 4:30, 4:15, because I couldn't wait to get into my area, start slinging the flour around and making the biscuits first thing in the morning. It was a way to reorient the task. Now the truth is, it can become blindingly dull just making biscuits all morning long. But it was the coolest thing on earth. it also helped me to do a transformation of my mindset because it hinged on the relationships I had with coworkers. If I failed, my relationship with my coworkers was not pleasant. So if I see my position as one not to let down those who are dependent on me, then I have the opportunity to live into a relationship that is healthy with my coworkers. Make sense? It also changes the way you think about everything. The way that you engage in the work becomes some sort of a difference because you have to think your part makes a difference to all the customers who walk into the store. So occasionally, customers will walk into that particular store and ask who is making the biscuits. You want to know why? Because I kept getting in trouble for not rolling them out thin enough, and then they'd pop up too big, and then my manager would have to, try to stick them shut. And that's because I wanted to provide the best for those who were customers. Or take another task. Occasionally, while working at Hardee's, I'd be assigned to clean you got to clean the bathrooms. Now, it's a mundane task, but you think customers who use the bathroom expect for it to be clean, don't they? Which means if I do my job well, not just as something that's drudgery or bottom of the barrel or couldn't there be someone else to go take care of it, then it's an opportunity to live into what makes everything about that place even better. Now there's examples from when I used to sell knives and take knives into people's houses and tell them that they're sharp and don't touch them. There are stories about working in an office making copies. Literally, it's all I did at the School of Music in Northern Illinois University. I made trillions of copies. But everything you do makes a difference to yourself and your mindset, which equips you to see your work as a calling if you're willing to employ yourself in that effort. It also makes a difference in society because what we do actually does transform our society. It not only meets the needs of ourselves, but ultimately, as we continue to work, we become altruistic and we use our profits as a means of serving other people. You see, in the Bible, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, the Apostle Paul is really wrestling with people who weren't willing to work, but who were interested in just riding the coattails of the rest of the church. The Apostle Paul says something almost mean. Those who are unwilling to work should not eat. But you know what Wesley did, John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, said that the goal of every Christian is to earn all you can, save all you can, and give all you can. Because it wasn't a means of gaining everything for yourself, that our work was designed to be employed in service for others. That it should have a benefit on society, not just for ourselves. And ultimately, if work is seen as a calling, it gives glory and honor to God. Because if everything that we do is an offering to God, then it provides us the opportunity to see how it is that we become co-creators, co-participants with the Spirit in creating. After all, when God says, let the earth bring forth vegetation, it's not that God necessarily creates every little thing, but the earth becomes a co-participant in creation. Read Genesis 1. The earth brings forth vegetation. That's where I think mosquitoes come from. If we view our work as co-participants with God, it begins to transform everything about our lives. And our calling then is to use the best of our skills to be employed for God. Now it's true, there are some situations where work is never going to be fun. But understanding the opportunity to see through transformed lenses, the way that God can equip us to see our work as a calling, can radically transform our lives. So, this week we talk about work. Next week we get to talk about leisure. See, it only gets better from here. And then ultimately we'll talk about the way that we redeem our time. The Benedictine rule in Roman Catholicism was always that we work and we pray. Next week, we'll hop over to the other end of the spectrum and talk about leisure and the interaction between the two.